Okay, so once again, good morning everybody. I think we can start right now. So we welcome you at our Arria-formula meeting dedicated to the crimes of Ukrainian armed forces and nationalist battalions. It is a follow-up on the discussion on the same topic that we had 2 years ago in May 2022. You can find the video record of this meeting via QR code that you have in front of you on your tables and that you see now on your screens. The latest Kiev regime's incursion into Russian territory, which left dozens of innocent unarmed civilians killed or injured, adds additional angle to our today's gathering. As we have already repeatedly indicated, the unconstitutional coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 resulted in an upsurge in nationalist organizations. The new authorities openly associated themselves with Ukrainian nationalist organizations which collaborated with German fascists during their invasion of the USSR in 1941 and are responsible for mass murders and atrocities against Jews, Poles, Russians, Ukrainian, Gypsies and the others. Their new incarnation adopted the same methods and hatred towards everything non-Ukrainian. Hence, such an attitude towards their fellow Russian-speaking neighbors who lived on this land for many centuries. In the 8 years that followed, nationalist extremism turned from a marginal phenomenon into a political mainstream with a distinct anti-Russian core. Residents of Donbass who did not accept this illegitimate nationalist government became second-class people to new authorities. They were labeled separatists and terrorists. The so-called anti-terrorist operation was launched against them by Ukraine. Recently, ICJ refused to satisfy Kiev's claim to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic as terrorist organizations. Thus, the whole anti-terrorist operation, or ATO, unleashed by those who usurped power in Ukraine, was a lie designed to camouflage a mere military campaign against its own civilians and its own citizens. The Russian-speaking southeastern part of Ukraine was shelled with heavy weaponry on a daily basis, and combat aviation was routinely used against peaceful cities. Our briefers today will provide you with first-hand accounts of what happened then. During that time, the Kiev regime has committed untold number of crimes. Intentional targeting of residential areas, destruction of civilian objects, murder of civilians, persecution of alleged collaborators were all established practices of Ukrainian soldiers and became true colors of the new authorities, which they did not even bother to conceal. To save time, I will not refer now to what happened between the start of Kiev regime's war against Donbass and the beginning of our special military operation in 2022, which was aimed at ending this war after sabotage of Kiev and its Western sponsors of the Minsk agreements. I will refer to only one case because it's exactly 10 years ago that the military forces of Ukraine shelled with cluster munition the riverbank beach near Donetsk with the name of Zugres. This became one of the benchmarks of Kiev's aggression against its own people. 13 people were killed at that moment, 3 of them children. 30 civilians were wounded. There are now memorial services going on in Donetsk region in memory of those who perished in this ruthless attack. So, turning the situation into NATO's proxy war against Russia, the West started to pump Ukraine with its weapons, and the number of attacks of the Kiev regime against civilians has multiplied. Systematic atrocities became an integral part of Kiev's military strategy. The Ukrainian armed forces regularly launch artillery and ballistic missiles on densely populated areas, deliberately attack civilians. In clear violation of international humanitarian law, Kiev's military regularly deployed and used heavy weapons, including artillery and air defense system, from residential areas, using local civilians as human shields. They have also become notorious for using apartments, schools and kindergartens as firing positions. There are many egregious examples. We will now show you a video of two local residents of Dzержinsk city describing atrocities of Ukrainian army.
I'm from the city of Dzержinsk. Our cellar was bombed and we jumped out, ran to the next one opposite. We ran and hid there. Within 2 hours, 6 houses on our street burned down by lighters and ammunition being dropped from drones above. Ukraine was dropping them. We stayed in the basement for 3 weeks. We don't have any water on the street at all. The sign said civilians. There were farms, ducks, chickens, and shells were still flying all the time. On Friday, we working together in the mine. A man who was already over 60 years old and his 37 or 38-year-old son came running towards us. The man's side has been shot through and his arm from the joint on the right side had been torn off. He said, "Help, save me, they're killing me." And he says the Ukrainian defenders in disguise have passed. And the military then started saying, "Why are you sitting here?" as they said, and waiting for the Russian government. We heard a foreign language, of course, saying, "Come on, come on." And just before that, a neighbor from the street further up came to us and said, "I saw both black people and Poles, and there are a lot of mercenaries." We were fleeing the war. Our house was burned down. Russian soldiers escorted us to a safer place and then transported us here. We were running. The road, of course, was hellish because we were running through minefields with drones hovering above us, which detect movements and immediately launch a projectile. There are only Ukrainian drones there. They knew that these were civilians and that they believed that we are traitors to the motherland. It used to happen that there were 10 people in one basement of a house. I don't know how many of them are still alive, but the 2 young people who were there are no longer alive. They had been shot. In another house, a woman and her husband were in the basement. We heard ourselves how the doors were opened and the iron door was knocked down and they were simply shot. There were at first screams, then shots, and then silence. They just entered silently, opened the door, saw that there were civilians, and still shot them.
I don't think that there is a need to comment what these people are saying. Against the backdrop of multiplying setbacks on the battlefield, the Kiev regime, after obtaining Western long-range artillery systems, regularly resorts to deliberately attacking non-combatants not only in the Donbas region, but also in neighboring Russian cities. Ukrainian army often shells civilian areas close to its border. You all recall multiple shellings of Belgorod, including the one on the New Year Eve, when 29 civilians were killed. They also unscrupulously employ most inhumane, abhorrent tactics, such as using UAVs to hunt down local residents and their cars and deliberately kill them. This was the case just last week when Ukrainian neo-Nazis directed a drone into an open window of a 5-story residential building in Shebekino near Belgorod, murdering an elderly woman. Well, you will see the footage of this right now. So you see on this video footage that the drone operator intentionally directed his vehicle towards a room with an open window of a peaceful residential building, fully aware that there could be only civilians who were targeted. Again, no need to comment. Colleagues, we had to modify our initial plans and to include into our narrative today an account of what happened at the border between Ukraine and Russia exactly a week ago, on August 6. So, in a clear attempt to achieve some kind of a PR victory for Ukraine, whose army is constantly retreating from its fortified positions in the east, set up in 2014 and maintained since then, The Zelensky regime launched on this day an adventurous attack on the bordering Russian regions. This is, by the way, the best rebuffal to all of our international partners who were claiming that the Kiev regime inclines towards peaceful solutions of the Ukrainian crisis. The response has been given, and it's a clear choice for escalation and military action. Don't tell us afterwards that we didn't warn you about this. The Zelensky junta also tried to provoke and attack Belarus. I believe that my Belarusian colleague will tell us the details later. As for the Ukrainian incursion into the bordering Russian region of Kursk, I will not touch upon here the insane rationale of the agonizing Ukrainian dictator who lost the remnants of his legitimacy back in May. Undoubtedly, this is a move that Ukraine will bitterly regret, as it has trained military reserves being eliminated there as we speak. I will only draw your attention to the methods that the Ukrainian nationalists are using on Russian soil, which are similar to the ones they used in Donbass. Let's watch some videos from the scene. On this video made by local residents, you can see the devastation caused by the drone attack. The asphalt pavement is damaged by shell craters of various sizes and covered with debris. Many buildings, including residential ones, have been significantly damaged. A local says there is neither gas nor electricity in the town. An ongoing attack on a residential building was caught on camera. Photos show damage to the church building as a result of the recent attack. These are just a small fraction of videos providing information about war crimes of Ukraine. There are many more examples in the internet. You see the church complex targeted here. Dozens of residents of Sudzha and neighboring towns were killed and wounded as a result of last week's attack. The whole of Russia was shocked when a 24-year-old pregnant woman was shot at close range and killed by Ukrainian militants while attempting to flee the area with her husband and 18-month-old baby. In another episode, the Ukrainian drone attack on the ambulance resulted in the deaths of both the paramedic and the driver. The latter left behind a wife and a daughter. They were responding to an emergency call in Sudzhansky district amidst shelling and Ukrainian drones flying overhead. Operator of one of the drones deliberately and knowingly struck the ambulance in a double-tag attack. We haven't heard a word of condemnation of these actions from Western sponsors of the Kiev regime, who continue to cover up the abhorrent crimes of their puppet in the same manner as they ignored its atrocities in Donbass for more than 8 years. They go on repeating that Ukraine has the legal right to defend itself, while referencing the attacks on civilians in the Kursk region. Maybe the delegation present today will be able to explain how deliberately killing an expectant mother or a 75-year-old woman in Russia correspond with the right to self-defense. We have a lot of video footage from dash cams depicting the exact moments when Ukrainian military shell cars and innocent people in them. Let's watch some of it, as well as evidence of small arms fire on 2 different civilian vehicles. On this video, you can see civilians attempting to leave by private vehicle the territory temporarily controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine. Although it is clear that the vehicle is not a military one, these residents were faced with fire from the militants. These civilians were deliberately targeted rather than caught in the crossfire of the fighting. This constitutes a gross violation of international humanitarian law, which prescribes to ensure the safety of civilians under any circumstances. There are many accounts and footages like this in the internet. If you listen to the sound, which we switched off for this meeting, you will hear the gunshots, and now you see the consequences for civilian vehicles. Despite all this evidence, we heard only statements of support to the Zelensky regime from United States and its allies, claiming that this military adventure fits into the Ukrainian efforts to disrupt attacks into its sovereign territory. I would be grateful for the explanation how intentionally targeting civilians serves the goals of disrupting attacks on Ukrainian territory, given the fact that there were no military objects or infrastructure in the area. To protect our population, Russia had to proceed with evacuation of civilians from the border zone of the Kursk region. Sometimes it was done under the supervision of local authorities. Sometimes people were able to do it on their own. On the following video, eyewitnesses, both local residents, described the horrors they experienced when the Ukrainian armed forces shelling began, and later when they tried to evacuate as drone operators dropped ammunition on their heads.
We were driving, we were praying to God that we'd get out of this hell alive because there was so much noise, debris, and the drones were flying all around. We drove about 1.5 kilometers away, and less than 1 kilometer probably, from the bushes, and there was where they shot at my car. So 2 bullets hit the bumper. I can show you that later. I had 3 people in the back of my car, and they missed them literally by 5 or 6 centimeters, otherwise somebody would have died. I understand that they definitely hit the car behind me because that car maybe didn't have time to get away, and they couldn't hit me, so we radioed in with the other car, and a man said that the man had been shot at. The woman was unharmed, but Sergei was not making any noise, so we stopped. I opened the door, and I could see that Sergei is already there. He must have been hit in the chest, in the heart, and through the back all at the same time, as if he had tried to cover the people sitting in front of him with his own body to protect them.
I would also like to spot some light on yet another issue. In violation of international humanitarian law, Zelensky's clique unabashedly resorts to a great variety of lethal means to hunt down the representative of the Russian press, because it is not interested for the world to learn the truth about what it is doing. Killings and persecution of journalists and war correspondents have become common practice for Ukraine's junta, with stated support from its Western sponsors. We already brought to the attention of the members of the Council terrorist attacks against such renowned journalists as Daria Dugina, Oleg Lokov, Rostislav Zhuravlev, Boris Maksudov, Semyon Yeryomin, Sergei Postnov, Valery Kozhin, and Nikita Tsitsagi, all of whom were cold-bloodedly killed in the course of the last 2 years. In the context of Kursk incursion, we saw another clear confirmation that targeting and killing journalists is a deliberate and conscious choice and strategy of Zelensky's army. Last week, a famous Russian war correspondent, Evgeny Podubny, was targeted and badly wounded by a Ukrainian drone in the Kursk region. where Yevgeny was performing his professional duties. The day of his attempted assassination, Podubny posted a video on his Telegram channel showing a Ukrainian armored vehicle shelling a car with civilians in the border village of the Kursk region. To finish my reference to the ongoing Ukrainian aggression in Kursk, I need to point out that those who counted that this barbaric attack will sow discord among Russians and scare them have made a fatal mistake. This criminal act has only consolidated our society and showed the true colors of our enemy, who deserves nothing but a complete defeat and unconditional capitulation. There are many more first-hand accounts, and our briefers will delve into details. I will just say that since 2014, these atrocities have resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, including children, as well as deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, schools and hospitals. No cause and no ideology can justify this, and all those who committed these crimes will not be able to avoid justice and accountability. Let me assure you that in Russia, all Ukrainian crimes against the civilian population since 2014 are thoroughly documented and investigated by the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. We will hear about this from one of our briefers today. Without further ado, let me introduce our first briefer, Mr. Rodion Miroshnik, Ambassador at Large of the Russian Foreign Ministry on the crimes of the Kiev regime. Rodion, представляю вам слово.
Rodion, you have the floor. Thank you very much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to participate in this event and have an opportunity to provide you with the data, the precision of which we have no doubt of and which we have at our disposal. The first thing I would like to tell you about is what I've seen with my own eyes and what I was directly a party to. 10 years ago, a Ukrainian warplane for several weeks had been circling over Lugansk, and on the 2nd of June 2014, it launched a strike on the main square from its cannons and launched a shell against the Lugansk Regional Administration building. I was there at the time, and I saw all of this with my own eyes. I also saw how subsequently 8 civilians whose torn bodies were left on the pavement after that strike. This was a summer day. Mothers with children were walking in the square, and those who were killed from this strike were either simply civilian passers-by or members of the local administration, local officials. A month later, that same Ukrainian warplane launched an airstrike on Staraya Kondrashovka outside Lugansk, where it killed 12 people, including a young child, Vanya, who just the day before had celebrated his 5th birthday, and on that day after was going around to give his neighbors slices of cake. He saw the plane in the sky and he stopped to take a look at it, and that was when the Ukrainian fighter, the Ukrainian warplane, shot up the entire street in this small village, and Vanya was killed on that day together with 11 other people currently living in that village. Can you see the photograph that I wanted to show?
You see them on your screens, dear colleagues. Да, фотографии у нас на экране.
Yes, we have the photos on the screen. You can carry on. A month later, on the 6th of August 2014, a Ukrainian warplane once again launched a strike, this time on Sukhodolsk in Krasnodon district in the Lugansk People's Republic, as a result of which immediately 17 civilians were killed, including small children. At that time, no Western leaders expressed outrage over the actions of the victorious coup plotters, nor did they propose providing the residents of Lugansk and other towns in the LPR with Patriot or NASAMS missile systems to repel the air attacks of the Ukrainian Air Force that, at that time, filled the skies above Donbass and Lugansk, and time and again launched strikes on cities and civilian objects. At that time, No Western persons proposed taking funds from the peace facility and using them to buy guns or ammunition for the Home Guard, which they could have used to defend themselves against the Ukrainian army, that with guns, tanks and air power, in violation of the Ukrainian constitution, had come to pacify Donbass. People in Donbass who were outraged at the unconstitutional seizure of power in Kiev. 10 years on, we can assert that this was only the beginning of the development of the selective blindness of the West and their double standards, and now it's only got worse. When Western leaders make gentle, permissive statements about Zelensky and his clique, or when they provide additional funds for armaments, this emerges directly in the form of more and more crimes against the residents of Russia. After the UK, France and the United States transferred long-range missiles to Ukraine, and following President Biden's authorization for them to be used against objects in Russia's regions, that's where they went. What do strikes on civilian and densely populated targets have to do with defense? An American ATACMS missile hit a residential building in Lugansk where 6 people were killed and more than 60 civilians were injured. And the entrance of this multi-story building collapsed like a house of cards. A cluster bomb hit a beach in Sevastopol where on that summer Sunday people had come with their families and children. And there, right away, 4 people were killed, including 2 children, and more than 150 civilians were injured. An agricultural produce shop in Sadovaya in Kherson region, French air bombs initially hit it, and then following that, when people had come to provide assistance, American HIMARS missiles hit it. And so ultimately, at this small agricultural produce store, 22 civilians were killed. All of these armaments were transferred to the Kiev regime under the noble pretext of defending Ukraine from alleged Russian aggression, but they were fired against civilian targets and civilians. If you have the impression that Ukraine can only be blamed for unintentional strikes on civilian objects and the civilian population, that's not the case. We can say with complete confidence that intentional violations of the norms and principles of IHL is something that Kiev is using as part of its military strategy. The killing of the civilian population, mass strikes on housing, hospitals, kindergartens and schools are intentionally being carried out in order to intimidate civilians, to sow confusion and to trigger civilian protests within the country. This cynical scorn for the norms and principles of international humanitarian law is only possible because the Western partners have provided the Zelensky regime with diplomatic cover. That is to say that at the international level they are blocking the spread of information about the monstrous crimes of the Kiev regime, and they are preventing a fully fledged investigation by international structures of Kiev's war crimes. The Geneva Conventions establish that intentionally launching strikes on medical personnel tasked solely with medical responsibilities is a war crime. The military political provocation in the Kursk region, started by the Kiev regime a week ago, began with the killing of a civilian medical team that had come to save the lives of wounded civilians who had been injured by the actions of the UAF and other nationalist formations that had come onto the territory of Kursk. The civilian medical brigade, the emergency medical brigade, went to Sucha to save the lives of wounded civilians who had been shelled by Ukrainian fighters who were carrying out a raid into Russian territory. But they were met not just by the bleeding out civilians, but also by a Ukrainian strike drone. And they waited knowing that assistance would come, and then they launched a strike on the ambulance that was properly marked in every way. It had a red cross and it had flashing lights indicating that it was an ambulance. The driver and the paramedic died right away, and another paramedic was seriously wounded, and she fortunately, she was saved by another ambulance. Subsequently, the fact that this ambulance was hit by an intentional strike is no accident. This is a fact of intentional hunting for medics. that were in order to deprive civilians of their hope of safety. This is the 9th Medical Brigade since the beginning of this year that has been shelled by Ukrainian fighters. 23 medics have been wounded and 4 of them died in the line of duty. If you look at the picture, that's what the ambulance looks like that was hit in Gorlovka. It was a monstrosity of inventiveness and inhumanity. First of all, they struck an energy facility that provided electricity to the city, and when they established that this was an accident and emergency ward, they then launched a strike on it, and 2 staff members were injured. When they called an ambulance and a wounded woman was attempted to be evacuated, the Ukrainian drone that was waiting above their heads launched a lethal strike on this ambulance. But that was only done when the wounded woman had been loaded into the ambulance and the medic had closed the door behind him. The wounded woman died directly in the ambulance, and the paramedic died along with her, the paramedic that had come to save her, and the driver of the ambulance was seriously injured. The fact that today's war has taken on a new technological level of traits is something that many people are talking about, but the fact that these technological achievements are being used to kill civilians is not something everyone is willing to admit. Strike drones that are currently second in the list of arms that are used most often in order to kill and maim civilians. In first place is still artillery weapons, which is actively being gathered by Czechia, knowing that they saying that they are doing an important humanitarian task. But drones, unlike shells, are weapons that of intentional killing. The drone operator can see perfectly well who he's launching the strike against, whether it's an old person, a child, or a woman, and they even have a video of what is happening. A week ago in Gorlovka, Ukrainian drones 3 times attacked an ordinary city tramway that was going across its normal route with civilians inside. One of the strikes was the cynical killing of someone in that vehicle, and there were injured passengers in the tram as well. And in the other cases, passengers as well as the conductor were injured. This seems to be a favored pastime for the Nazis. Just a few days ago in neighboring Belgorod Oblast, when thousands of people left their homes fleeing the aggression of Ukrainian fighters, the Nazis continued to use drones to hunt civilian vehicles. In this car, 2 women were driving when they were hit by a Ukrainian drone. They ended up in hospital with serious injuries. The most bloody strike by Ukrainian drones on civilian transport was the attack of 3 drones at the same time on 2 microbuses that were carrying workers to an agricultural business. 7 civilians died immediately, a further 2 died in hospital, and more than 40 more were injured. To kill civilians and seriously injure and maim them, Ukrainian Nazis are using the entire range of weapons that is provided to them by their so-called Western sponsors that are complicit in the bloodshed. To kill civilians, they're using everything from Canadian sniper rifles to American long-range missiles with cluster munitions, and today those missiles hit Lysychansk and Lugansk republics. More than 30 people there were more than 30 casualties. And that was also the Swedish drones and Czech vampire missiles. Since the beginning of the year, civilians and civilian objects in bordering areas have been hit by the Ukrainian fighters by more than 52.5 thousand shells of various different modifications and calibers. In only the first 7 months of this year, more than 2,622 people have been wounded and more than 523 have died. In conclusion, I would once again like to come back to the events 10 years ago. On a warm summer's day in 2014, I, for the first time, faced a situation in which people became worse than animals. A monstrous person from the Ukrainian rights sector trying to ensure the complete blockade of Lugansk directly exploded the water supply node providing water for half of the city. And then a Ukrainian sniper, having taken up a position, targeted all of the entrances to the destroyed building and for several days fired upon the brigades, preventing the repairing of the building and preventing the restoration of the water supply. In the morning, people took empty bottles and went on foot to a well across town in order to fill up with water and be able to cook and drink water. In hot days or on their way home, they had to do this carrying a simple bottle of water. At the same time, a Ukrainian sniper was preventing the restoration of the water supply to the city. At the time, this seemed to me insane and inhumane, but we've been living with this insane inhumanity for 10 years, and we continue to be surprised by more and more cases of inhumane cruelty that, unfortunately, the countries that are spending their taxpayers' money to support the totalitarian and criminal regime in Kiev don't want to acknowledge. Thank you for your attention.
Спасибо большое, Владимир Валерьевич.
Thank you very much, Rodion Valeryevich.
And our next briefer, Mr. Maxim Grigoriev, is a member of Public Chamber of the Russian Federation, chairman of the International Public Tribunal on Ukraine. He has interviewed more than 800 victims of the atrocities of Ukrainian armed forces and will share witnesses' first-hand accounts. Maxim, the floor is yours. Maxim Erkeyevich, пожалуйста.
Благодарю.
Thank you. In March 2022, a group of human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers at an international conference created the International Public Tribunal on the crimes of Ukrainian neo-Nazis. At present, it includes representatives of civil society from more than 30 countries. Its main job is to gather information about the violations of the Geneva Conventions and war crimes and to provide that information at international platforms, and also to transfer that information to the judicial organs of any country in order to prosecute those crimes. I remind you that according to international humanitarian law, war crimes do not have a statute of limitations. The materials and reports that we have prepared are public in nature. One of our latest reports was handed over by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov, to the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And that report is available for any media outlets that want it. Since 2022 alone, we have interviewed more than 800 victims and witnesses of Ukrainian crimes. Almost all of the people that we interviewed gave consent for their testimony to be used publicly, as well as for their names and surnames, as well as their place of residence when they were interviewed, to be made public. People from any country or the media can very quickly go through that data, talk to those people, and ask them to clarify any of the details of the Ukrainian crimes in question. I would like in particular to note that the gathering of information itself about the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces and neo-Nazi units is something that we began doing in 2014. In 2015, in the UN office at Geneva, I presented our report entitled "The War Crimes of Ukrainian Security Forces, Torture and Inhumane Treatment of the Residents of Donbass." The basis for this report was our interviews with more than 200 victims of Ukrainian torture. These are civilians and Home Guard members in Donbass. Over this time, the practice of Ukrainian atrocities, war crimes, and terrorist acts has become mass in nature. There is no doubt that this is an intentional and thought-out policy by the Kiev regime. Because of the limited amount of time we have today for our event, I'm going to show you today just 3 interviews with witnesses of those crimes out of more than the 800 that we have collected. Once again, I'll repeat that we stand ready to provide all of this material to any media outlet. The first of these testimonies is the testimony of a French citizen, the journalist Arria-formula. Please play the video. Please introduce yourself. Hello, my name is Arria-formula. I'm French. I am a former military man, and I am 31 years old. As far as I understand, you were witnessing the murder of the Russian soldiers. Can you tell me where it was and what it looked like? Of course, in the first days of April, the Ukrainian army came to Bucha. In our car, we were accompanied by an Azov fighter. We came to Bucha absolutely without any passport control, and thanks to this agent. First of all, I noticed the corpses that were lying in the center of the city, in the center of Bucha. And at that moment, I saw how other corpses were being taken out of small cars. Those corpses were taken out by the military and civilians and were being laid out next to the ones that were on the road. At that moment, journalists were waiting for the corpses to be laid out, and as soon as the corpses were there, they started taking pictures. And I immediately realized that they had prepared that performance in order to make the most impressive photos. Please tell me, you've already told me about the fact that in Bucha it was very clear that this is just a case of falsification. Can you tell me, did Western journalists realize that they were participating in falsification? Well, of course, because a journalist who is waiting for the corpses to be stacked in a certain way, there is no way that he can't know what's going on. You also talked about how the bandages and how they tied those corpses up, how they bandaged them, that they were absolutely new, but that the bodies themselves, well, it was raining, there was mud. Can you tell us in more detail what you mean when you say that? Of course, I'll tell you about that. The fact is that it had been raining in Bucha for 2 days, and these corpses that were lying there were very, very dirty, and their hands were not tied at first. And then they showed me photographs of what was there, and that the corpses had their hands tied with very clean rags or bandages, which I had never seen when I was in Bucha. It's very strange. How can you explain the fact that there are these very dirty corpses, despite the fact that it had rained for 2 days, and then there were these clean bandages tying their arms? One of the volunteers who came to Bucha before me told me that they had carried the corpses from one house to another, and then they took them to Bucha and they laid them out. Did they carry corpses from one house to the other, or did they do some sort of photo shoot? What I saw with my own eyes is how the corpses were taken out of the cars and laid out in piles. What my colleague, another volunteer, saw was how they were transported the day before that from another city to Bucha. As you can see, this testimony is exhaustive and is confirmed by many additional witness statements and statements of victims that we also received in the form of interviews. Again, anyone who wants to can see those freely. The Ukrainian armed forces, in violation of the Geneva Conventions, are killing and torturing Russian service personnel and civilians en masse. Fighters from the terrorist neo-Nazi Azov brigade are also participating in this. They do not hide their neo-Nazi views, and they are supported and armed by the government of the United States. I would like to note in particular that in the past, the US Congress officially acknowledged that this unit was a neo-Nazi unit, but that is not preventing the United States from supporting them now. I would also like to specifically draw your attention to what was said by the journalist Arria-formula about about the falsification of the alleged crime by Russia in Bucha. He told in detail, as you saw and heard, how Ukrainians brought corpses and specially laid them out in the center of town, and then the Western media filmed those corpses. And he also provides other specific evidence of Ukrainian falsification of what happened in Bucha. But there's nothing new in all of this. These sorts of mass falsifications are things that we dealt with during our investigation of those supporters of terrorists, the White Helmets in Syria. As you know, this organization was also financed by European countries and the United States. We interviewed in Syria many participants in staged scenes, and they told us in detail about how all of this happened. But the cynicism of the Ukrainian authorities is significantly greater than that. They're not just organizing falsifications, not just staging these scenes, they're also killing people in order to do so. We have collected a great deal of evidence of how Ukrainian authorities intentionally rounded up their citizens under various pretexts in border areas, for example, by saying they were handing out food or water, and then they shot them. They fired upon them. Then Western journalists who were on duty in the nearby area, in the space of 5 to 10 minutes, came to the scene as if by accident, and they filmed then these people who had been killed, and subsequently then this was presented in the Western media as the result of Russian shelling. The next witness of Ukrainian crimes is Tamara Karyak. I'd ask you to play the video with her, please.
Как вели себя украинские военные?
Could you tell me how the Ukrainian military behaved vis-à-vis the residents of Artyomsk? Well, what can I say? They fired at us from mortars and tanks. My daughter was wounded by shrapnel. They were shooting at our house and windows with automatic weapons. They wouldn't let us go outside. We couldn't bring in firewood. We had to do all of that at night, in the dark. They also wouldn't let us bring in water. We collected rainwater when it rained, filtered it several times. If there was snow, we gathered snow instead. We filtered it several times, waited for it to melt and filtered it, and then used it for food, for cooking. Can you tell us more about how they shelled these ordinary houses? The mortar would come to a neighboring street, but hit a neighboring street, and then from there they would shoot houses that were still intact, one way or another. There were constantly drones hovering above us that were tracking people. If people were walking down the street, the military would track which house they were going into, and then they shelled that house. And you're saying specifically civilians? Yes, civilians. And how did your daughter get wounded? When did that happen? That happened around about the 3rd or the 5th, certainly the beginning of February. We were in the house, we were at home. My daughter heard something moving. A tank approached and opened fire. Of course, it broke a window and damaged a wall, and the shrapnel hit her in the arm. Thank God everything was okay. We were able to get the shrapnel out from her arm and bandage it up, and thank God it was nothing too serious. At that time in early February, were there Russian forces there? No, there were no Russians. We only saw them on the 10th of March. So the 10th of March, and there were no military troops there, none except for the Ukrainian army. Why were they shooting peaceful civilian homes and residents? I don't know, that's how they fought. As my neighbor told me, she came up to a fighter in the market one time in a new micro-district and said to this soldier, "Guys, are you defending us?" And they said with a smile that they'd come not to protect us, but to kill us. That testimony is confirmed by hundreds of other witness statements that we've gathered. If you could take the video down for now, and we'll put it up a bit later. If you could take that video away for the time being, please. We're not showing the video, so please go ahead. So that testimony is confirmed by hundreds of other victims and witness testimonies that we've gathered. The Ukrainian armed forces intentionally destroyed and continue to destroy towns and villages on their territory and are killing their own civilians. That is being done because, based on the Nazi ideology of Ukrainian nationalism, they believe that Russian-speaking residents of those places are their enemies. They're enemies whom the doctrine of Ukrainian nationalism believes it necessary to physically destroy. That doctrine also existed in the same way during the Second World War and before the Second World War. The main, or one of the main elements that they were calling for is the physical destruction and creation of so-called ethnically pure areas. That was what the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists called for. And now the homes of civilians, together with those same civilians, are being destroyed by the Kiev regime also because, notwithstanding their statements in the West, they understand that these areas and districts will never again be part of Ukraine. All of these intentional attacks on the civilian population are gross violations of the Geneva Conventions, and according to international humanitarian law, they constitute crimes against humanity. And the last interview now that we have time to look at is the testimony of Anatoly Kryachka. Please play the section of his testimony. I can tell you personally what I heard. There was a mortar crew standing nearby me. The Ukrainian gunner sent the coordinates by radio, the coordinates for firing, and the soldier responded in Ukrainian. These coordinates are the center of the city. The gunner repeated the same coordinates, and the soldier standing next to him said, "What do they pay you for? You're told to shoot, so shoot." In the center of the city. Yes. When, more or less, did that take place? Well, for us, every day is like a month. It was, roughly speaking, about a month ago. So the end of February, about the 20th of February. Yes. The Russian military were standing on the horizon where the Kharkov is located. On the other side, there's a monument. They weren't in the Western micro-district yet. And they weren't in the center either. That testimony is also exhaustive. Ukrainian soldiers are refusing to fire because they understand that they're killing civilians and destroying civilian homes, but they're forced to do so. In our interviews, we intentionally ask about the location of Russian forces at the time of these Ukrainian attacks, and the witnesses underscore specifically, as you've just seen, that the Ukrainian forces were very aware that the Russian forces were still far away, and they intentionally fired upon their own settlements and villages and their own civilians. We have dozens of pieces of evidence of this sort of Ukrainian war crime. And today, I only showed you 3 of more than 800 witness statements and victim statements of Ukrainian atrocities. The work of our human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers as part of the International Public Tribunal on the Crimes of Ukrainian neo-Nazis is not a state body, it's public in nature, and we have very limited resources. Consequently, we understand that we are only able to record a very small fraction of Ukrainian crimes. In fact, we're talking about many tens of thousands of Ukrainian atrocities and war crimes. But of course, the governments of Western countries are all too aware of this. Just the fact that they are directly supporting the bloody Kiev regime prevents them from talking honestly about what's happening in the Western media. But once again, there's nothing new in any of this. Just like now they're doing for the Ukrainian dictator Zelensky, in the past, Western countries also supported the bloody dictator Pinochet in Chile. The leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and European countries met with him. Those meetings were put on in the Western media, and they said how much that he'd done to strengthen the Western world. But ultimately, it was only Pinochet's death that was able to save him from prison, which was where his closest accomplices ended up. And I have no doubt that the current leadership of Ukraine will face punishment. In conclusion, I would once again like to add that war crimes do not have a statute of limitations. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maxim Sergeyevich. You're right, there is indeed no doubt that all of those criminals will be duly punished. We will absolutely make sure we achieve that.
Thank you very much. And our last guest today, an expert on Ukraine, assistant professor at University of Banja Luka, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Oleg Soldat. Oleg, the floor is yours.
Добрый день, пожалуйста.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen and dear colleagues, thanks for having me. In the fall of 2022, I took part in the referendum in the new Russian territories as an international observer, one of 130. I had the opportunity not only to hear about the ongoing constant of the atrocities of the Ukrainian regime against the Russian population, but also to record the evidence of those crimes committed in the previous period from 2014 until the referendum. What follows is only part of what the residents share with us, many of them, of what we as an heard and what our international colleagues, One Course and others shared with us. In June 2014, for example, we've heard that after the capture of Mariupol by those same Ukrainians that would subsequently form the notorious Azov battalion, arrests of representatives of each pro-Russian movement began. Those taken hostages were first taken to the Mariupol airport, where they were tortured. In particular, they suffered electric bound and strangled. Olga Seyetskaya, who was later exchanged, activists disappeared with whole families. While she was in captivity at the Mariupol airport, she constantly heard a machine gun fire, and now what was typical Nazi practice, according to the witness of local residents, the crematorium near the airport worked almost around the clock. As another survivor of the Mariupol airport testifies, he was kept in a refrigerator chamber in shorts and t-shirt. He was also regularly taken up for interrogations, during which he was tortured, after which the activist was left disabled. After the Mariupol airport, Olga Seletsky and several other activists were taken to the Mariupol branch of the Security Service of Ukraine, where the torture continued. She says that she saw people in security of Ukraine basement with signs of beatings, plastic bags, ties on their arms, and so forth. Almost all of them had plastic bags on their heads tied with tapes around the eyes and so forth. Some of those who were taken away for interrogations never returned at all. According to those who were exchanged afterwards, militants arrested and illegally detained Russian-speaking Mariupol residents who were by any chance pro-Russian. As the same Olga Seletsky said after the exchange, she tried to find her comrades in the movement, but the whereabouts of most of them are unknown. Further, during the battles of Ilovaisk in 2014, the Nationalist Battalion of Donbass and the Dnieper illegally detained local residents who were suspected of not supporting the anti-state coup in Kiev. Russian-speaking residents were held on the territory of 2 schools in Ilovaisk. According to the same local residents, they were kept in metal cage or boxes in the heat. Some of the detainees went missing. Local residents assumed that they were killed. Also, during the same battle of Ilovaisk, the Ukrainian army used phosphorus bombs against civilians. Residents of Ilovaisk showed traces of its use in their houses, bodies, and adjoining areas. A veteran, for example, of the Great Patriotic War living in Ilovaisk said that during the fighting, militants from one of the nationalist units came to him and threatened to shoot him and his wife, citing the fact that the veteran fought on the side of the Red Army against Nazi Germany. They took the old man outside, but for some reason abandoned their plans. One of them told the veteran that they would have done the same to everyone who fought on the side of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War as a signal, ideological signal of the pro-Nazi mental orientation of the Ukrainian army. During the Battle of Volnovaha in 2022, which means almost during the same period before the referendum, residents said that the retreating units of the Ukrainian army forces deliberately placed mortar points in artillery, which our previous colleagues confirmed as a matter of fact and constant practice, near residential buildings and social institutions in order to draw fire on civilians, citing, among other things, that civilians allegedly support Russia. According to one of the local residents of Volnovaha, she witnessed one of the Ukrainian armed forces servicemen says that I would kill all of you civilians of Volnovaha because you will still go over to Katsap's. Katsap is a slave word for Russian. During the battles for Mariupol, local residents were regularly shot by radicals from the Azov regiment. In the testimonies given after the liberation of Mariupol by captured militants from the Azov regiments themselves, they indicated that the main motive for shooting civilians was the assumption of cooperation with the Russian army. Example, one of the militants said that during the battles of Mariupol, while taking up a position in one of the houses, he saw 2 men walking towards the crossroads, feeling hostility towards them and assuming that they could help the Russian army somehow. He opened fire on them, and both men were killed. This is just a specific examples of hundreds of the same stories heard just concerning Mariupol battle. One of the convicted militants said that in the villages where the Ukrainian armed forces were stationed, he killed a man assuming that he sympathized with the Russian army because he spoke Russian without an accent. He also raped and beat a young woman and then threw her into a cesspool to die. He justified such a brutal method, and we've heard many stories like this, brutal method of murder by saying that he just wanted to watch a person die. According to him, he sat by the pit for about an hour, watching the woman slowly passing away. During the same notorious battle for Mariupol, Azov militant entered a basement where civilians were hiding. According to the residents in the basement, he loudly asked them, "What are you waiting, the Katsaps? The residents hiding in the basement did not answer him, fearing reprisals. "You won't get it," shouted the Azov militant, and leaving the basement threw a grenade there, but by lucky chance, and we still almost can't believe this, it did not explode at this particular instance. For example, when the special operation had just begun, the Russians liberated one of the first villages, and there, one woman told our sources that a couple of days later, several people in Ukrainian military uniforms came to the local village school and took about 20 children to an unknown destination. Later, sources on the Ukrainian side reported that the children were taken to Kramatorsk and housed in one of the schools. The school was used to be for the attack, which Russia was to blame for afterwards. Similar situations with the illegal removal of hundreds and essentially thousands of children, allegedly in order to take them to safe place from the Russian influence, took place in Artyomovsk, Bakhmut. This was done by the group so-called White Angel. They operated under the protection of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine. Such groups have been formed along the entire front line between the two states, let's say. And most often, if they manage to take a child away, nothing else is known about the whereabouts of the child. In some rare cases, parents were able and managed to find their children, but not where they should be or supposed to be or said to be, according to the representatives of this organization. So this would be only a small part, literally a slice of a huge evidence material, which I was in a couple of weeks and couple of days was simply given the time frame we were given for your attention, unable to compile the bigger evidence for this. It just gives, in my opinion, a slight overview of what is essentially is organized system of reprisals, crimes, and repressions, and is being conducted according to our latest sources to this very same day, wherever they are being allowed to do so. So I wanted to share just one of these. Thank you for your attention.
Спасибо большое, Олег.
Thank you very much, Oleg.
Colleagues, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that all materials presented today by the briefers and our mission are available via the QR code that you now see on your screen. Now I open the floor to those members of the Council who wish to speak in the order in which they appear on the list of speakers. I encourage you to limit your speaking time to 3 minutes. First on my list is Malta.
Chair, once again, we are gathered at the request of the Russian Federation in a meeting whose sole purpose is to allow Russia to try to justify its brutal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. For more than 2 years, Russian forces have been killing civilians, including children, humanitarian workers, and journalists. Civilians can no longer find shelter in schools and hospitals. Russia continues to bomb civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, and laying mines in agricultural fields to deprive the Ukrainian population of the necessary means for their survival. The full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law remains Malta's priority. Since February 2022, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 11,430 civilians killed and 23,228 injured in Ukraine. The continued and intensified attacks affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure are deeply concerning. Relentless attacks, especially in the Donetsk and Kherson regions, have killed or injured civilians, including children, and damaged homes, education and health facilities, further affecting access to basic services. In clearer terms, this means that children have had their schooling interrupted, or in some cases stopped. This means that women have not been able to access maternal care and have their lives further put at risk. This means cancer patients and other needing treatment have been able to access such services. This is unacceptable and needs to stop. The latest report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine shared new evidence of the crimes committed by Russian forces in violation of international human rights and international humanitarian law in Ukraine. The Commission reported that Russian soldiers had further committed killing, torture, rape, sexual and gender-based violence. Furthermore, Russia's war continued to shatter thousands of childhoods. Children in Ukraine have experienced violence, isolation, separations from families, loss of loved ones, deportation, and disruption of their daily lives. The Russian armed forces have also used children as shields, committed sexual violence against them, and denied essential humanitarian access. The long-term consequences and mental health impact of such actions cannot be overstated. Malta reiterates its deep concern at the scale and gravity of these violations and crimes which have been documented. We stress once again the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. We also reaffirm our support to the ongoing work of the ICC and the Register of Damage for Ukraine, as well as the efforts towards the establishment for a future international compensation mechanism and a tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately end the war it started and withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And I thank you.
Соединенные Штаты.
The United States.
We are here because the Russian Federation has decided once again to use the Arria-formula format of the UN Security Council to try and shift blame onto Ukraine, the victim of Moscow's brutal war, and deflect attention away from the rampant devastation Russia has imposed on a UN member state, Ukraine. There is no question as to which country has committed numerous well-documented atrocities, including war crimes and crimes against humanity on Ukraine's sovereign territory, devastating civilian infrastructure, destroying schools, hospitals, and residential buildings, and forcibly transferring and deporting children. That country is Russia. Our message to Russia's leadership and military who commit war crimes or other atrocities is this: the world is watching, and you will be held accountable. In the judgment of history, Russia's attempts to obfuscate the issue by slandering Ukraine will only bring further shame on the Kremlin and all those involved. We all know the truth of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. We reject any effort by any country to justify supporting Russia in its clear, ongoing violations of international law, including the UN Charter. There is no excuse for any of us to neglect our collective responsibility to hold Russia accountable. As the United States has said before, the Kremlin must stop its war of aggression against Ukraine and stop using the Security Council to hide the truth about the devastation from Moscow's own actions.
Slovenia.
Slovenia.
Mr. Chair, I take note of the statements by the briefers. I would like to make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Number one, Slovenia treats accusations of Nazism and international humanitarian law violations with utmost seriousness. We also strongly reject any kind of political manipulation with such accusations. Let me be clear. We will not recognize the aggressor as the victim. Slovenia supports and will support Ukraine in its defense against aggression. It is quite clear to us that in Europe, the current threat of territorial expansion by aggressive war, occupation, and annexation based on nationalism and military means does not stem from Ukraine. Two, numerous times we have warned against selective references to violations of international law. We denounce double standards in application of international humanitarian law. It is odd listening to accusations of IHL violations while the accuser is bombing critical energy infrastructure and children's hospitals. Slovenia is aware that the current international framework has an accountability gap when it comes to crime of aggression and supports the establishment of a special tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We believe that this will lay important groundwork for justice to be served in the future. In order to achieve a just and lasting peace, accountability for perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity must be ensured. There is no sustainable peace without justice. Victims and survivors must have a central role in these processes. In relation to the war on Ukraine, Slovenia has repeatedly called for timely, effective, and comprehensive accountability measures. In this regard, we strongly support the International Criminal Court, which is the best avenue to ensure accountability and can bring justice for the victims, all the victims of this war. I thank you.
Япония.
Japan.
Mr. Chair, the concept note for this event invites us to discuss ways to achieve sustainable and long-term peace. We welcome this discussion. Our position can be summed up in a few words. The aggressor must leave Ukraine. This war of aggression ends when the aggressor stops it. The solution is straightforward, and there's no need for further arguments. If the aggression stops, meetings like this would be unnecessary. I'm sure that our Russian colleagues are well aware of this. Today's meeting is yet another example of Russian hypocrisy and the waste of UN resources. It is also another attempt by Russia to divert attention from what it is doing in Ukraine. Neither the member of the Security Council nor the wider UN membership should be subject to such distractions. To the permanent member of the Security Council in violation of the UN Charter and member states which support it, I urge you to reflect on your own actions. The UN Charter is a very cornerstone of the international order that the global community has tirelessly worked to uphold. Russia, bearing the primary responsibility for global peace and stability as a council, violates even the Security Council resolution, which Russia itself supported. The repeated calls by the UN General Assembly clearly show that the aggressor's attempts to justify its actions never prevail. All member states, including Russia, must agree that there can be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities. Justice demands that those responsible for these undeniable crimes be held accountable. The aggressor will not gain from its actions. Alongside Ukraine and the international community, we continue to strongly demand Russia to immediately return to compliance with the UN Charter. I thank you.
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Chair. I also thank Mrs. Myroshnik, Grigoriev, and Soldat for the information provided. Since the start of the conflict in Ukraine, there have been accusations and counter-accusations of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Sierra Leone takes note of numerous reports on missiles and drone attacks on civilians and civilian objects, indiscriminate attacks, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and essential services. There have been allegations of conflict-related sexual violence, which we also take very seriously and to which we expressed our gravest concern. We reiterate that these acts are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. They pose a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law, and are tantamount to war crimes. Sierra Leone continues to express grave concern about breaches of international humanitarian law and human rights law in relation to the Ukraine conflict and stress the need for accountability for the alleged atrocity crimes committed. Consequently, we call on the conflicting parties to cease hostilities. As Sierra Leone urges for a political horizon, the opening of communication lines for direct peace dialogue, we also underline the need to focus on impartial investigations for determining the facts on the ground to ensure accountability. Sierra Leone also calls on all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international law and take immediate steps aimed at de-escalation and to commit to protecting civilian lives and infrastructure in conflict zones. The current escalation in fighting, which has considerably extended the front line into Russian territory, is of deep concern. It represents an escalation of the conflict. This escalation is further exemplified with the deployment of additional troops by Belarus to reinforce its border with Ukraine, citing Ukrainian drone incursion into its airspace during Ukraine's Kursk offensive and the threat by Belarus to take appropriate action. Additionally, we are desperately worried that with fighting occurring near the Kursk nuclear power plant, the threat of a nuclear catastrophe is a chilling reality. In this vein, we fully agree with the statement of the International Atomic Energy Agency issued on 9 August 2024, urging all parties to exercise maximum restraint to prevent a nuclear accident that could have the potential for serious radiological consequences. The devastating impact of attacks on civilians, including women and children, calls for the involved parties to choose and prioritize peace and put an end to the violence. Peace cannot be left to chance. Sierra Leone therefore reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting resolution of the conflict. We re-emphasize that diplomacy and dialogue is the only viable option to ending the conflict. In taking this important step, we call for the full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account. Let me therefore close, Mr. Chair, by condemning violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law and emphasizing that all parties to the conflict uphold their obligations under international law. Sierra Leone condemns all attacks on civilians and civilian objects, especially critical infrastructure, and urges all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and to take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. The protection of civilians must be paramount in any conflict, including the conflict in Ukraine. Ensuring that the parties to the conflict prioritize the safety of civilians and eventually cease hostilities must be the utmost collective priority of the Security Council. I thank you.
Thank you. Guyana.
Thank you, Chair. Guyana takes careful note of the remarks delivered by the briefers. Guyana has maintained a steadfast commitment to upholding and supporting an international order guided by the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We firmly believe in accountability for illegal actions of all parties engaged in the conflict and emphasize that impunity for violations of international humanitarian law must never be tolerated. Further, we stress that history cannot be rewritten through war. International law must be the recourse for those who seek redress for any real or perceived wrongs, and it is the sound obligation of every member state of the United Nations to uphold the organization's principles. The war in Ukraine, without a doubt, has gone on for far too long, and while we are understandably frustrated by the lack of progress towards a sustainable solution, we must remain committed to the pursuit of a just and lasting peace. This war must end. Guyana reiterates our condemnation of the use of violence against civilians by all parties and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We call upon all parties to uphold their obligations under international law, including respect for territorial integrity. We feel compelled to take this opportunity again to highlight an important but often overlooked consequence of war: the diversion of resources from development towards the acquisition of arms. Even when wars end, the significant costs of rebuilding often set development back by many years. Armed conflict, even when rooted in legitimate defense, has long-lasting negative consequences on the lives of millions across the globe, and civilians, including women and children, always bear the brunt. Attacks against critical Ukrainian infrastructure have continued and even intensified in recent months, causing billions of dollars in destruction, including extensive damage to energy infrastructure. The ongoing hostilities have resulted in the deaths of over 11,000 civilians, injuries to thousands more, and has forced millions to flee their homes. The devastating impacts of a prolonged conflict are made clearer with every day that goes by. We must once more stress that as members of the United Nations, We are all obligated to abide by the principles of respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, the prohibition on the threat or use of force, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. Guyana will continue to be a fierce advocate for the peaceful resolution of this and other conflicts that continue to plague our world. We are a partner to all states in the pursuit of diplomatic solutions and are committed to playing a constructive role in any efforts that can bring lasting peace, security, and stability to Ukraine and its people. We urge all parties to come to the table and begin to talk. Lives and livelihoods depend on this. I thank you.
Thank you. Ecuador.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you,
He
Mr.
escuchado con
President.
atención a
I
los
have
ponentes.
closely listened to the
El
briefers.
Ecuador condena
Ecuador
todos los
condemns
abusos y
all of the
violaciones de
abuses
derechos
and
humanos y
violations
del
of
derecho
human rights
internacional
and of
humanitario
international
cometidos en
humanitarian law
Ucrania y
committed in
apoya los
Ukraine. We
esfuerzos de las
support the
Naciones
efforts of
Unidas
the
y
United
otras
Nations
organizaciones
and other
internacionales
international
para documentar
organizations
esas
to
violaciones.
document these
Es
violations.
necesario
It is
continuar con
necessary to
investigaciones
continue with
rápidas,
expeditious,
independientes e
independent, and
imparciales
impartial
de todos los
investigations
presuntos
into
abusos y
all
violaciones
of the
a
alleged
fin de
abuses and
garantizar
violations in
justicia a
order to
todas las
guarantee
víctimas
justice for
y
all
la
victims
rendición de cuentas
and to
de los
guarantee
responsables
accountability
mediante los
for the
mecanismos de
perpetrators
justicia
through
adecuados.
adequate justice mechanisms.
Lamentablemente,
Regrettably, the
el
conflict
conflicto
continues
continúa
to
afectando
gravely
gravemente a la
affect
población
the
civil.
civilian
El
population.
Ecuador insiste
Ecuador
en que las partes
insists
tienen
that
que
parties
evitar el uso
must
de armas
avoid the use
explosivas
of
en áreas
explosive
pobladas
weapons in
y
populated
alejar los
areas
combates
and
de
move
zonas urbanas.
fighting away from
Las
urban areas.
operaciones militares
Military
deben
operations
centrarse
must
únicamente
focus
en
solely
objetivos
on
militares,
military targets,
respetando el derecho
respecting
internacional
the international
humanitario que
humanitarian
prohíbe
law,
ataques
which
contra
prohibits
civiles
attacks
e
against
infraestructuras
civilians and
civiles.
civilian infrastructure.
Es
It
fundamental que
is
se proteja
pivotal
al
that
personal humanitario
we
y
protect
se
humanitarian
garantice un
personnel
acceso
and
pleno y sin
guarantee
obstáculo
full
a
and
la asistencia
unimpeded
humanitaria
access
para que ésta
of
llegue a todos
humanitarian
quienes la
assistance so that
necesitan,
that assistance can reach
especialmente a
all
los
those
más
who need it,
vulnerables.
particularly the most vulnerable.
Todo esto es
All of the above is
particularmente importante al
particularly
haberse conmemorado
pertinent
ayer
given that
el
yesterday we
75
marked the
aniversario de la
75th
adopción de los
anniversary
convenios
of
de
the
Ginebra de
adoption of the
1949.
1949 Geneva
Por otra
Conventions.
parte, el Ecuador
Elsewhere,
reitera su
Ecuador
condena a
reiterates
cualquier
its condemnation
despliegue
of
de
any
discursos
use
que
of
incitan al
discourse
odio
that
y a la
incites
intolerancia.
hatred and
Su utilización
intolerance. The
probó su
use of
capacidad
such discourse
destructiva en
clearly
los años
demonstrated
previos a
its
la Segunda Guerra
destructive
Mundial
capacity in the
y
run-up
por
to
lo
the Second
tanto
World
su
War,
uso debe
and
ser
consequently
desterrado de
its
manera
use must
definitiva.
be stamped out once
Señor
and for all.
Presidente, la
Mr.
historia
President,
nos ha
history
enseñado que
has
ninguna
taught us
crisis
that
se
no
resuelve
crisis
por la
can
vía
be
militar.
resolved via
La
military
violencia
means.
solo engendra
Violence
más
only
violencia y
produces
sufrimiento.
more violence and
El
suffering.
Ecuador,
Ecuador,
por su propia
given its own
experiencia,
experience,
reconoce que la diplomacia
recognizes
y el
that
diálogo
diplomacy and
permiten
dialogue
superar
make it
incluso
possible to
los conflictos
overcome
más
even the
antiguos y
longest-standing
construir un
conflicts
futuro
and
compartido
to
entre
build a
países
shared
hermanos.
future between
En
brotherly
tal sentido,
countries.
el
With that in
Ecuador
mind,
reitera
Ecuador
su apoyo a la
reiterates its
soberanía e
support for the
integridad
sovereignty
territorial
and
de Ucrania
territorial
dentro de sus
integrity of
fronteras
Ukraine within its
internacionalmente
internationally
reconocidas
recognized
y
borders,
sostiene que una
and
paz justa y
maintains that
duradera
a
en
just and
Ucrania
lasting
puede
peace
ser
in Ukraine
alcanzada a
can be
través de la
reached through
negociación y la
negotiation and
diplomacia
diplomacy,
enmarcada en el derecho
rooted
internacional
in
y la
international
Carta de las
law
Naciones
and the
Unidas.
United Nations Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. Mozambique.
Chair, we thank the Russian Federation for convening this meeting, which takes place against a backdrop of unrelenting escalation. We are also unsettled by the testimony of the briefers and individuals seen today. Chair, we recognize the indispensable role and the legitimate right of regular armed forces in safeguarding national security, territorial integrity, and protecting a nation's sovereignty against both real and potential threats posed by external actors. However, it is imperative that the exercise of this legitimate right occurs within a structured and orderly framework. Anarchy, characterized by weak central authority and widespread disorder, undermines the effective exercise of such rights and compromises the rule of law. Similarly, concerning is the insidiousness of extremist elements within armed forces which pose a profound threat to integrity and cohesion of military institutions, undermining the core values, compromising national security, and leading to violations of both national and international legal norms. This is particularly alarming in the present global context, where the surge of intolerance, incitement, and extremist ideologies threatens to fracture societies, undermining efforts to promote national, regional, and global peace, as well as mutual understanding, further exacerbated by a rampant and volatile information sphere. With these concerns in mind, we firmly believe that armed forces must be subject to a robust internal disciplinary system that enforces compliance with international humanitarian law and applicable international legal standards, promoting accountability. Chair, the protection of civilians is not optional. It's a legal obligation and a cornerstone of both IHL and IHRL. In this regard, the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously adhered to by armed forces. Equally important is the obligations of states to unequivocally protect individuals from discrimination of any kind, including on the grounds of language and national origin. States must take proactive measures to eliminate any incitement of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes instigation to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Furthermore, states must firmly condemn and criminalize all forms of propaganda and organizations that promote ideas of racial superiority, including ideologies such as Nazism and neo-Nazism. This is particularly poignant given the immense sacrifices made by both Russians and Ukrainians in the fight against fascism and hateful ideologies. Chair, ultimately it's the use of armed forces in the relations between states that should always be considered as the ultima ratio, the last resort. Military actions cannot replace the essential need for political and negotiated solutions, which remain the only viable means to resolve conflicts. Diplomatic channels must continue to be pursued to achieve sustainable peace, especially when the stakes are as high as they are in the current escalating situation. I thank you.
Thank you. Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Switzerland deplores the fact that, once again, an Arria-formula meeting is being used by Russia to promote its biased vision of reality. These attempts to justify the Russian military aggression against Ukraine will not convince anyone. This military aggression constitutes a flagrant violation of international law, including of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. The suffering visited upon the Ukrainian population for almost 2.5 years and the destruction of critical infrastructure on a large scale are unacceptable. Inquiries undertaken and the documentation provided by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry in Ukraine and by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, as well as by the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE and the ICC, make that patently clear. Switzerland remains alarmed by the increasing piles of reports documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity allegedly committed by Russia since the beginning of the military aggression. The disregard for civilian security seems to continue to be patently clear. Proof of that are the several recent attacks that claim civilian victims in recent days, including the destruction of a supermarket in Konstantinivka. That must stop. We insist on the urgent need to strictly comply with international humanitarian law and human rights by all parties. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected. We recall here that international humanitarian law attaches special protection to installations installations containing dangerous forces, such as nuclear power plants. The violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law must be subject to in-depth inquiries, and alleged perpetrators of crimes must be brought to justice. Switzerland supports accountability efforts being deployed at a national and international level, in particular the work of the ICC. We call upon Russia to fully cooperate with the international monitoring and inquiry bodies, namely by guaranteeing them access to the regions of Ukraine that they currently occupy. By way of conclusion, Switzerland reiterates its appeal to Russia to put an immediate end to this military aggression and to withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory. We remain committed to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in accordance with the United Nations Charter. I thank you for your attention.
United Kingdom.
Chair, Russia started this war. Russia has chosen to perpetuate this war. It was Russia's imperialist ambitions which drove it to illegally annex Crimea in 2014 in violation of the UN Charter and cause an outbreak of conflict in the Donbass. It was Russia's choice to amass forces of over 130,000 troops on Ukraine's borders in 2022. And it was Russia who abandoned the path of dialogue, walked away from the Minsk agreements, and launched a full-scale invasion into Ukraine. An invasion that has been repeatedly condemned by the General Assembly. Colleagues, Russia says it wants to discuss violations of international humanitarian law and other crimes. The United Kingdom welcomes such a discussion. As Russia reminds us, all parties to a conflict are required to distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects. Yet Russia's destruction of energy infrastructure has wiped out 9 gigawatts of Ukraine's power generation since March. And in July alone, 80 medical and educational facilities were damaged or destroyed by Russian attacks. Since February 2022, OHCHR has recorded almost 200 cases of summary executions of Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, and 263 cases of sexual violence, all perpetrated by members of Russian law enforcement and the armed forces. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry, established by the Human Rights Council, has described Russia's use of torture against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war as widespread and systematic. 95% of prisoners of war report torture. The International Criminal Court has issued 6 arrest warrants for Russian government figures. This includes the Russian president and his children's commissioner for their deportation of Ukrainian children, and Russia's former defense minister and chief of general staff for attacks against electricity infrastructure. And Russian soldiers are carrying out indiscriminate violence against civilians, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia. Former convicts, required to serve 6 months less than the ordinary conscript in the Russian armed forces, are reported to have killed at least 58 people on their return. So let us be clear. This is Putin's war, and the means by which he and his armed forces pursue it, which is the crime here. The UK again calls on Russia to end its illegal invasion and withdraw its forces from Ukraine. We will never falter in our support for Ukraine, and for as long as it takes to secure a just and sustainable peace based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Thank you.
France.
Thank you, Mr. President. France is today participating in this umpteenth exercise of propaganda that Russia is deploying with one goal in mind: to ensure that Russia's lies do not remain unanswered. Playing the same record of misinformation over and over again will not allow Russia to amend the facts or distort the reality of its war of aggression against Ukraine. The facts are very clear and have been established by the competent authorities of the United Nations. They're quite damning for the Russian army. Inquiries conducted by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry of the United Nations on Ukraine have demonstrated that there is widespread and systematic use of torture and sexual violence by the Russian armed forces, as well as other violations of human rights and IHL. Russian strikes on the Kramatorsk station against a residential building in Vinnytsia, on the Kharkiv printing house, or on the children's hospital in Okhmatit in Kiev have deliberately targeted civilians. The strike on the shopping center of Konstantinivka 4 days ago are a cruel reminder of that fact. These strikes, just like those that target energy infrastructure, are part of Russia's strategy of intimidation against Ukraine, with flagrant disregard for the lives of Ukrainian civilians. Let us also recall that Russia is once again listed in the most recent annual report of the Secretary General on children and armed conflict, because Russia is responsible for killing, maiming, and attacks against schools and hospitals. The International Criminal Court on the 5th of March 2024 issued 2 arrest warrants against Sergei Ivanovich Kobylat, Lieutenant General of the Russian Air Army, and against Viktor Nikolaevich Sokolov, Vice Admiral and Commander of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, for the campaign of missile strikes against Ukrainian civilian energy infrastructure. These attacks are part of a state policy on the part of Russia and may constitute crimes against humanity. The denial of crimes committed by Russia in Bucha, then at Izium, and in other liberated Ukrainian towns is an outrage. The images of mass graves and violence against civilians in these towns sparked condemnation and outrage throughout the world. The maneuvers used by Russia to conceal these crimes come as no surprise to anyone. Once again, Moscow is adding to the indignity of killing civilians and children the indignity of lies and negationism. The reality is that Russia invaded Ukraine and is committing an ever-growing number of violations of IHL and human rights against a nation whose identity it denies and who it refuses the right to freely determine its foreign policy. In support of its war of aggression, it deploys a revisionist reading of history, one which serves to normalize and spread hate speech and incitement to violence. We will continue to support the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We will not allow Russia to instrumentalize the memory of the struggle against Nazism during the Second World War to justify its own imperialism. Thank you.
Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Chair. In February 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter and international law, abandoning the peaceful path to resolve the conflict in the region. Since the beginning of this war, the Republic of Korea has consistently urged Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine and end violations of the UN Charter and global norms, which have underpinned the international system for more than 70 years. This is also exactly what the international community has called for, as multiple General Assembly resolutions supported by the overwhelming majority of member states have affirmed. In this regard, we regret that Russia has called today's meeting in an attempt to justify its illegal invasion against Ukraine. Any accounts detailed today simply do not change the fact that Russia invaded its neighboring country in violation of its sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. We firmly believe that resorting to violence and the use of force cannot resolve the conflict. Indeed, it only jeopardizes the fundamental basis for resolving the conflict. We all know the devastating result of this brutal war over the past 2.5 years. We stress that there must be accountability for all war crimes in due course. In this regard, we support the activities of Independent International Commission of Inquiry in Ukraine, established by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights, violations of humanitarian law, and related crimes in the context of the aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation. We will also continue to closely monitor Russia's illegal weapons procurement from the DPRK, alongside the worrying trend of enhanced military cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow. This is all the more vital after the 1718 Committee panel of experts ceased delivering its crucial monitoring mechanism against such illegal activities due to Russia's veto on this mandate renewal. We strongly urge Russia to stop its military cooperation with DPRK, which violates the multiple UN Security Council resolutions and undermines the international non-proliferation regime. And my delegation reiterates its call for Russia to fulfill its solemn responsibility as a permanent member of the Security Council, the ultimate guardian of international peace and security, by ending this war. I thank you.
China.
I thank you, Chair. I thank the briefers for sharing their information. The fighting in Ukraine is still raging on and yet to show signs of relenting. The frequent occurrence of vicious attacks and civilian casualties is deeply concerning and heart-rending. Every day the conflict continues. Casualties of innocent civilians increase, and the risk of escalation or even loss of control of the fighting rises. International humanitarian law should be adhered to by all. A red line not to be breached. Civilians and civilian infrastructure should not be targets of military operations. We call on the parties to the conflict to strictly abide by international humanitarian law and effectively protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for enhancing the protection, in particular, of the most vulnerable groups, including children and women. On the issue of Ukraine, all diplomatic efforts by China have been sending the same message, namely to protect peace talks and advance a political settlement. History has long proved that all conflicts must be resolved by returning to the negotiation table, and all disputes must be resolved through political means. At present, the focus is to adhere to three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fueling the flame by any party, so as to expeditiously de-escalate the situation and realize a ceasefire. We call upon the parties to the conflict to demonstrate political will, move toward each other, launch peace talks at an early date. The international community should also take an objective and impartial position and create conditions conducive to that end. China will continue to maintain contact and communication with all the parties concerned and support the international community in building more consensus, making unremitting efforts to play a constructive role in promoting a political settlement of the crisis. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Algeria.
Thank you, Chair. I thank Ambassador Rodion Roshnek, Mr. Maxim Grigoriev, and Mr. Oleg Soldat for their briefings. Since the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, Algeria has been consistently and constantly clear. Algeria has at every opportunity highlighted the urgent need for de-escalation and the cessation of hostilities. We repeatedly urged the parties to protect civilians and infrastructures and uphold their commitments to international law and international humanitarian law. In the meantime, we have always stressed the need to put an end to the loss of lives, people suffering, and destruction. I would like today to reiterate our call to the parties to avoid confrontation and prioritize a peaceful resolution to this crisis, guided by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concerns of both parties. Towards that end, we once again encourage the parties to engage in sincere, inclusive, and constructive dialogue to achieve a peaceful resolution. Also, it is important to redouble our diplomatic efforts to create the conducive conditions to genuine dialogue and negotiations to resolve the crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. I have now non-council members who wanted to take the floor. I recognize Syria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I would like at the outset to thank you for convening this meeting, which comes a few days after the barbaric attack launched by Ukrainian forces against civilian population in the Kursk region, which caused the death of many innocent civilians, including ambulance crew, and the injury of dozens, including children, as a result of the artillery bombardment by Ukrainian troops. I'd like also to express my gratitude to all the panelists and briefers for their valuable testimony, which elaborated some of the untold stories about the IHL violations and other crimes committed by the Ukrainian military and militias. Grave violations of the international humanitarian law, as well as other war crimes committed by Ukrainian military personnel and militia during the ongoing conflict, must not be ignored, and obligations under the IHL must be preserved and implemented in an objective and balanced way. Mr. Chair, we do believe that the latest Ukrainian attack would not have taken place without the aggressive policies of the Western countries, which continue to aggravate the conflict and to turn a blind eye to the inhuman practices against the residents of Donbas region for more than 10 years. Moreover, we cannot view the latest attack in Kursk region apart from the role played by NATO countries to escalate tension and hostility towards Russia and to threaten its regional security and stability by providing all sorts of heavy weapons and missile systems to Ukraine, including banned weapons. We call on all the Western countries to stop its hostile policies towards Russia and to play a constructive role to restore peace and security for the whole region. Thank you.
Thank you. Belarus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to inform you about an incident that took place just a few days ago and which has already been referred to today. On the 9th of August, from the territory of Ukraine, a group of strike UAVs was launched, which violated the border of the Republic of Belarus and which were shot down by the anti-air defense forces of our country. This is an extremely serious incident which could lead to a radical escalation of the situation, and this incident is a very dangerous attempt to expand the zone of the conflict currently going on in our region. At the same time, they're trying to draw Belarus into this conflict, Belarus which has consistently called for settling the crisis and ending the bloodshed in the region. There has already been a reference here to the Minsk agreements. You're all very aware of the Minsk agreements, which, if they had been fully implemented, we wouldn't be sitting here today and we wouldn't be discussing the problems that we're discussing. Unfortunately, and this came to light subsequently, the leadership of a number of guarantor states of the Minsk agreements had no intention of implementing those agreements. Rather, they took advantage of this pause to provide additional armaments to Ukraine. The day following this incident, on the 10th of August, the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Belarus held a briefing at which they informed everyone in detail about the events that took place the day before. Information was provided minute by minute about what happened in the airspace of the Republic of Belarus and how Ukrainian UAVs were destroyed. In relation to that event, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Belarus gave an order to strengthen the group of Belarus forces in the relevant tactical areas in order to react to any possible provocation. The military units, the special operations forces, the ground forces, the missile forces, air power, including Iskander complexes, received instructions to that effect. The Ministry of Defense, in that regard, declared that Belarus would closely monitor the situation and would be ready to respond to any changes in this area. In relation to the incident on the 10th of August in the Ministry of Defense of Belarus, the chargé d'affaires of Ukraine was summoned. The Ukrainian diplomat was handed a firm protest, and they were given a note in relation to the crossing of the border of the Republic of Belarus by a group of UAVs that were launched once again, I'll repeat, from the territory of Ukraine. The Belarus side demanded that all necessary and exhaustive measures be taken to ensure that such incidents are avoided in future, because this could lead to a further escalation of the situation in the region. Ukraine was warned that if there was a repeat of such provocations, Belarus reserved the right to undertake the necessary retaliatory steps in order to defend its territory. And it was also indicated that if the diplomatic representation of Ukraine in Belarus is not able, and in future is not able to help prevent such provocations in future, Belarus will then reconsider the expediency and appropriateness of the presence of the Ukrainian diplomatic mission in Minsk. And incidentally, today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine responded to these events, and it was a very interesting response. Just a moment ago, they said the following: the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine does not see any particular expediency in responding to the statement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Belarus. That's a very interesting reaction. On the day after that, on the 12th of August, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the chargé d'affaires of the European Union in Belarus. The European diplomat had the position of Belarus on this incident explained, and particular attention of this European diplomat was drawn to the fact that a number of the elements of one of the UAVs that was shot down by Belarus's air defenses, they found markings indicating that it was produced in countries of the European Union. Belarus stated that such actions have the potential for the radical escalation of the conflict, and that escalation could bring with it a serious expansion, including into the European Union. Belarus consistently has called for a peaceful settlement of the crisis, including through negotiations, and calls upon the European Union to take all necessary measures to ensure, to influence the Ukrainian leadership in order to prevent such incidents being repeated in future. And in conclusion, I will say that given the dangerous nature of the situation and the global risks, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belarus will, and has already begun to, provide detailed information about this incident to the United Nations, to the OSCE as well. We have already asked for these materials to be circulated as official Security Council and General Assembly documents within the United Nations. We have already initiated consultations with our allies and partners through international structures as well. Belarus will, in full, exercise its right to self-defense and give a due response to any provocation or any hostile actions involving the use of absolutely all existing forces, means, and capacities. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Valentin Valerievich.
Is there any other delegation that wishes to take the floor? I recognize. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chair. DPRK delegation. Okay. Would like to take the floor. Thank you, Chair. And we thank the briefers for informative and elaborative presentation coupled with a telltale evidence on the violations of IHL committed by the Ukrainian armed forces. Anyone with a keen insight into international affairs will easily understand the prevailing situation in Ukraine is an inevitable fallout from the long-standing crisis that has been ignited since the 1990s. As already known, in the wake of the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, NATO reneged on its promise that it would not expand the alliance by even an inch, and admitted 14 countries in East Europe, the Balkans, and Baltic Sea on 5 occasions. Later on, it went further even to talk about the entry of Ukraine at the doorstep of Russia. It is a well-known fact that the NATO's policy of eastward advance, pursued by the US and the West, is aimed at tightening besiegement against Russia with the ultimate goal of weakening and defeating it. Russia had repeatedly warned the US and NATO of their dangerous moves, but the latter have persistently ignored the former's legitimate and just demand and systematically undermined the regional security environment by openly attempting to deploy the attack weapons systems in Ukraine. In the final analysis, it can come to the conclusion that the hegemonic policy pursued by the US and the West, which have persistently resorted to military threats and pressure, compelled Russia to start preemptive military actions to fundamentally remove the external military threats against it. The US and the West absurdly argue that their huge arms support to Kiev authorities is aimed at to make Ukraine defend itself from what is termed Russia's aggression. But this is nothing but crude sophism. As commented by experts on international affairs, the real intention of the US and West offering huge military hardware to Ukraine is intended to continuously drive Ukraine into a proxy war and thus beat down Russia at any cost. It is also aimed to meet the interests of the US military complexes and further deteriorate the security situation in the region by taking advantage of the situation in Ukraine and thus keep the European countries under its control and maintain its hegemonic position. If the US continues with its reckless military assistance to Ukraine, it will inevitably trigger more powerful countermeasures from Russia, which will in turn aggravate the security situation in the region and increase the risk of a military conflict. Ukraine's pro-US submissive policy is the very reason why the present crisis in Ukraine has erupted. At the instigation of the US, Ukraine oppressed the Russian-speaking residents in Donbass, trampled on the long-standing cultural ties with Russia, denied the history of the Second World War, and revived Nazism. All of this is attributable to the ongoing tragedy. As is widely known, after the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis, the Ukrainian armed forces committed hundreds of unethical atrocities of killing innocent civilians and striking civilian infrastructure in the territory of Russia, including Bryansk, Belgorod, Kursk, Donetsk, with artillery pieces, drones, and multiple rocket launchers offered by the US and the West. What should not be overlooked is the fact that the US and the West, which have been hell-bent on demonizing Russia with such labels as massacre of civilians, child abductions, and human rights abuses, are playing deaf and dumb about the killings of peaceful citizens by the Kiev regime. The US and the West are no less than biggest sponsors of terrorism, as they are adding fuel to the flames of war by encouraging terrorists to attack the Russian territory with the weapons offered by them, not content with providing them with a huge arsenal of lethal weapons. Russia's stronger response for safeguarding the national interests and safety of its citizens is a just and legitimate right to self-defense, which is undisputable. On this occasion, we strongly condemn and give a serious warning to the ROK's reckless move to groundlessly spread the rumor of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. It cannot be overlooked that ROK's outrageous hostility toward and interference with a traditional friendly and cooperative relationship have overstepped the limit. We consider such move as a part of its hostile attempt to tarnish the image of the DPRK in the international arena by invoking the illegal sanctions resolution of the Security Council against the DPRK. We have never recognized the Security Council unlawful sanctions resolutions against the DPRK, which were cooked up by the US and its vassal forces. At the present, The increasingly dangerous relations are the US-led alliance, which constantly threatens security environment of independent sovereign states, featuring aggressive and exclusive nature. The US-Japan ROK triangular military alliance, which has clearly uncovered hostility towards the DPRK and its neighboring countries, and NATO, the mastermind of the Ukrainian crisis, are just the cancer-like entities jeopardizing the international order based on the purpose and principle of the UN Charter and posing a grave threat to global peace and security. ROK, which is subordinate to the United States and obsessed with extreme hostility towards the DPRK and the Russian Federation, has neither qualification nor justification to interfere with a good neighborly relationship between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. ROK should be mindful that it will face a really undesirable result if it persists in setting afloat the fabricated rumor against the DPRK. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I will now give floor back to our briefers in case some of them wants to make some very short final remarks. I recognize Rodion Miroshnik. Please, Rodion, 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It was very interesting to participate in today's Security Council Arria-formula meeting, and I have to underscore the great level of interest that a number of countries have shown in considering this issue, which of course is shows respect for that. However, someone who has over 10 years been actively participating in the operations along the contact line, well, as that person, a lot of people weren't entirely clear, particularly as someone who for 8 years participated in the Minsk process negotiations, and those things that were said in this room did not always chime with our understanding of those processes that are actually taking place on the ground. And so in that regard, I'd just like to point out that statements saying, like, your statements won't convince anyone, don't really speak to a desire to bring about a peace and to find a peaceful settlement to the conflict. It talks more about bias and a complete reluctance to listen to the other side of the conflict. Allow me to assure you that dialogue begins with an ability to listen to someone who is presenting the other side, and another side that is perhaps not very pleasant for you and your side. Today, unfortunately, in this distinguished room, I didn't hear anyone calling upon Kiev to withdraw its forces from the sovereign territory of the Russian Federation in Kursk region. And on the contrary, I only heard statements according to the same old playbook that continue to demand Russia to withdraw forces from the territory of Ukraine. This is complete bias, and it raises serious questions and indicates a lack of interest in launching a peace process. Once again, many of those who spoke said that they wanted a peaceful settlement, but I would dare to assure you that the events that started a week ago and that continue, the activities undertaken by Ukraine, raids on the sovereign territory of the Russian Federation in Kursk region, have essentially put on pause any possibility for a peaceful settlement and have set back by many months that prospect. And unfortunately, not a single word was said about that. I also unfortunately didn't hear questions related to Ukraine's regular strikes on radioactive objects. We're talking about the Kursk and Zaporozhye nuclear power plants, which, as everybody knows, these are attacks that were organized and carried out by the Ukrainian side, but nobody here in this room, and I'm talking primarily about the representatives of Western states, didn't say anything about that. I also didn't hear anyone expressing concern over the attacks on ambulances, attacks on journalists that are trying to cover these events and bring real information about the conflict. Since the beginning of the year, more than 10 Russian journalists have been injured, and some of them have died during the conflict. When in the room we hear people say that Ukraine needs to be given more and more weapons, I understand that when I say that since the beginning of the year alone, 55,000 attacks on civilian objects or facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation, well, those words simply weren't heard or listened to. And this is a continuation again of that position that presupposes complete intentional blindness vis-à-vis one side of the conflict. When I hear a listing of a number of objects that the representatives of a number of states are particularly worried about, including the United Kingdom, I would like to just list a number of objects that would also be very interesting for those countries to look at. First of all, investigating the ATACMS strike on the beach in Sevastopol, the strike on Belgorod using HIMARS missiles, American-made HIMARS missiles, the attack on Lysychansk in the LPR where some 40 people were killed. All of those things I would like to be part of diplomatic discussions, and in particular the issue of torture in the library in the former airfield of Mariupol. Why is nobody talking about that here, and why is nobody willing to discuss those issues? I would like to say that as regards some of the statements that were made here today in the UN Security Council, in this lofty chamber, I would like to say that if this sort of rhetoric and a complete reluctance to listen to the real picture of events on the ground continues, then the Security Council will move further and further away from being a real mechanism that would, in actual fact, allow us to get on the path of peace, which, incidentally, Russia has never refused to do. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in today's meeting. Thank you very much, Rodion.
If there are no more speakers, then I will make very short final remarks. Colleagues, as the saying goes, we can bring the horse to the water, but we can't make it drink. You all have ears and eyes, and it's your choice whether to use them or how to use them, or not to use them at all. It's a matter of your conscience and personal choice. I thank those of you who find courage to call spade a spade. I also thank those who continue to spread lies and fake claims about Russia, as all your words are now registered and will be part of future trials and processes. We understand that our Western colleagues, for political reasons, are still in the face of denial of any uncomfortable truth about true colors of the Kiev regime. In your perverted black and white picture of the world, Ukraine is good and Russia is bad, no matter what real truth is. The fact that we came to Ukraine to stop the war that it launched 10 years ago to save residents of eastern Ukraine from extermination is something that you want to vehemently deny. I will refer to the words of our American colleague. He spoke about collective responsibility. I totally concur. It will come to this. And you're absolutely right. The world is watching, and all who committed crimes will be held accountable, no matter whether they are in Kiev, Washington, London or Brussels. And today you had the opportunity to see that this process is gaining momentum in Russia. Rest assured that we will not stop there. For those of you today who were calling for peace and diplomacy, I would like to reiterate the bitter reality once again. In June, my country made a very generous negotiation proposal to Ukraine, given its desperate situation on the front line. We learned the answer a week ago. The Zelensky regime chose escalation and war through incursion into peaceful Russian region. This is a fatal mistake that will be desperately regretted by Ukraine later, but the choice has been made. What is still to be known is whether it was made with full knowledge of its Western backers or whether it was a personal act of madness. The last time we saw German tanks on our territory was exactly 80 years ago. Now they are being driven by Ukrainians. You all remember how it ended for Germany back then. The end will be no less inglorious for Ukrainian Nazis today. And it's up to you whether you will continue to side with them and get drowned together in disdain and disgrace, or to finally choose the right side of history. The choice is yours, ladies and gentlemen, and don't tell us that we didn't warn you. So, I thank everybody. The meeting is adjourned.